You see the headlines all the time, right? North Korea fires another missile. Tensions are flaring up again on the peninsula. But here's the thing. Those headlines, they often miss the real story. And that story isn't just about North versus South. It's about this global game that's been played on Korean soil for like over 75 years. So to understand what's really happening today, we've got to look beyond the daily news and dive into the history that created this whole mess.
I mean, it really is the question that just hangs over everything, isn't it? The Korean Peninsula, it just feels like it's in the state of perpetual crisis, like a forever war that's just paused. And if you really want to understand the tensions today, you have to see that it's not random. There's a pattern here, one that's been repeating for decades.
And yeah, these aren't just random flare-ups. No way. They're part of this really dangerous cycle. Just look at 1994. North Korea was threatening to pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Clinton administration, they were drawing up detailed war plans. I'm talking about the Pentagon briefing the president on a conflict that could cause 1 million casualties. I mean, it was that close. So you see, this isn't some new problem. It's a crisis that's been going on, and it's deeply, deeply embedded.
So, okay, how do we make sense of this cycle? Where do we even start? Well, for this explainer, we're turning to a really landmark piece of journalism, the book The Two Koreas. And what it does is offer this crucial outside-in view that really helps cut through all the noise.
You know, the author, Don Oberdorfer, he wasn't just some academic writing from a distance. Nope. This guy was on the ground. For 4 decades, he covered the region. He was interviewing presidents, generals, and diplomats on both sides of the divide. And that's why his work is so important. It gives us this incredibly rare, balanced perspective, not from the viewpoint of Seoul or Pyongyang, but from an observer who's just trying to connect all the dots.
All right, so to really get to the root of the conflict, the book takes us right back to the very, very beginning. And this is where the story is just, well, it's kind of shocking. It turns out the division of this ancient unified nation, it wasn't some long, thought-out plan. It was a decision made pretty much on a whim, in a matter of minutes.
Seriously, the story is almost unbelievable. Okay, so picture this. It's August 1945. Japan has just surrendered. Soviet troops are pouring into Korea. Washington panics. They need to create a dividing line, and they need it fast. So who do they give this job to? 2 young Army colonels. And get this, there are no Korea experts around to help. So what do? They grab a National Geographic map, see the 38th parallel cutting the country kind of sort of in half, and they just draw a line. That's it. In 30 minutes, a decision that would change world history was made, and there wasn't a single Korean person in the room. And the consequences of that one line on a map, absolutely catastrophic. Just 5 years later, war exploded across the peninsula. We're talking about a conflict that claimed an estimated 3 million lives, soldiers and civilians. It became one of the most brutal wars of the entire 20th century. And that hastily drawn line, it was cemented in blood, turning what was supposed to be a temporary division into the permanent, heavily militarized border we see today. And you know, that moment, that initial division, it set this powerful precedent that is still playing out today. And it's this: the fate of the Korean Peninsula has almost never been in Korean hands. Instead, it's always been dictated by the strategic interests of much, much larger powers. I mean, just look at what a difference a decade can make. In the 1960s, you've got the Cold War in full swing. The 2 Koreas are locked in total hostility, each one backed by their superpower patrons. But then, fast forward to the early 70s, and something huge changes. The US, under Nixon and Kissinger, decides to open up relations with China. And all of a sudden, having a chaotic Korean peninsula is really inconvenient for both Washington and Beijing. So what happens? They push their respective Korean allies to the negotiating table for the very first time. Now this is one of the most revealing details in the entire book. In their secret meetings, American and Chinese diplomats found they actually agreed on something. They both felt that the leaders in Seoul and Pyongyang were, well, too emotional, that they were dangerously unpredictable and needed to be managed by the great powers. So the key takeaway here is pretty stark. That historic dialogue didn't happen because the Koreans suddenly wanted to talk. It happened because American and Chinese interests demanded it. And don't think for a second that this pattern of outside influence is ancient history. It hasn't gone away at all. Sure, the names and the ideologies might have shifted a little bit, but the Korean Peninsula, it's still a central square on a global chessboard. Today, that game is played primarily between the United States and China. Let's break it down.
For the US, South Korea is a critical ally, right? It's a forward base for projecting military power across Asia. But for China, North Korea is this absolutely essential buffer zone. It prevents a unified, democratic, US-allied Korea from existing right on its border. Now here's the catch. Neither power actually wants a war, but neither wants to lose its strategic position either, and that traps the peninsula in this incredibly tense status quo. And it's really important to remember that this isn't always a simple story of a heroic South Korea and a villainous North Korea. It's way more complicated. In fact, Oberdorfer's reporting shows that during those big nuclear negotiations in the 1990s, American diplomats sometimes found that their ally in Seoul was actually the bigger obstacle to getting a deal done, even more so than Pyongyang. Why? Well, Seoul was terrified of being sidelined. And that right there, it really messes with that simple good guy versus bad guy story we usually get. So if there's one key takeaway from all of this, let it be this. The Korean conflict, from the moment it began right up to today, has been shaped, fueled, and managed by outside powers. It is a profoundly Korean tragedy for sure, but it's a tragedy that has always been tangled up in the strategic games of others.
And that, well, it leaves us with a pretty heavy final question. As this rivalry between the US and China gets more and more intense, what does that mean for the 75 million people who actually live on the peninsula? In a game where they've never really been the primary players, who is ultimately going to decide their fate?
Hello and welcome. We usually think of the Korean Peninsula as this one single story, right? A nation just tragically split down the middle. But what if I told you that's not even half of it? That underneath all that, there's a secret history, a wild narrative of covert ops, backroom deals, and a hidden race for the most dangerous weapon on Earth. Let's get into it. So, you think you know the story. We're going to put that to the test. Because the history that we all learn in school, it tends to skip over the most dramatic, the most revealing, and honestly, the most important parts. These are the moments that really define the relationship, not just between North and South, but with the entire world. For this explainer, we're diving deep into the incredible reporting from the book Two Koreas to pull back the curtain on the truths that have shaped the peninsula. We're talking about stories of jaw-dropping diplomacy, deception, and ambition that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. Okay, our first secret takes us back to the 1980s, a decade of just insane competition. It's a story about two Koreas playing this incredibly dangerous game, and they were using everything in their arsenal, from charm to sheer terror, to get ahead on the world stage. I mean, just think about this for a second. It's the early 80s. And Seoul is trying to host the 1988 Olympics. Who are they up against? Nagoya, Japan, an absolute economic powerhouse. Nagoya was the clear, hands-down favorite. So how on earth did South Korea pull off one of the biggest upsets in Olympic history? Well, the answer was a secret plan, a plan led by the founder of Hyundai himself, Chung Ju-young. It had a code name and everything, Operation Smile. And it was as bold as it sounds. The goal? Super simple. Charm, persuade, and do whatever it takes to win the votes of the undecided members of the International Olympic Committee. And get this, the ambassadors of Smile were literally Miss Korea contestants and Korean air flight attendants. And the so-called entertainment? Oh, we are talking millions of dollars spent on all expenses paid trips, first-class flights, you name it, all targeting those key voters from developing nations. It was a full-on charm offensive, and believe it or not, it worked. Big time. But while South Korea was busy winning with smiles, North Korea was plotting something absolutely horrific, something designed to completely shatter that Olympic dream. And this, right here, is where the story takes a very, very dark turn. Just look at this timeline. The timing is chillingly precise. Less than a year before the Olympics, North Korean agents blow up a civilian airliner, killing all 115 people on board. It was a brutal act of terrorism, meant to scare everyone away from the Seoul Games. But then, look at the timing of the agent's capture. She's brought to Seoul, paraded in front of all the cameras, the day before a super tight presidential election. This stoked massive fears of an attack from the north and pushed voters right into the arms of the conservative, security-first candidate, who then won. It was a terrorist act with brutally effective political consequences. Now, this high-stakes game of manipulation wasn't just an 80s thing. No way. In fact, its roots go back about a decade earlier to a moment when the absolutely critical alliance between South Korea and its main protector, the United States, came dangerously close to completely shattering. You see, on paper, it was supposed to be a summit between allies. In reality, it was a total collision course. You had U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who was determined to pull U.S. troops out and was hammering South Korean President Park Chung-hee on his human rights record. And then you had Park, a military dictator, who saw all of this as a direct threat to his country's survival. Their goals weren't just different, they were polar opposites. And the result? An absolute disaster. Instead of a calm negotiation, President Park basically lectured a furious Jimmy Carter for almost an hour straight, refusing to give an inch. You can just imagine the tension in that room. One American official who was there later said it was the worst meeting he'd ever seen in his life. He said it wasn't a summit, it was a battlefield. So here's why that matters so much. The failure of that summit was public. The whole world could see this huge crack in the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And some analysts believe this made Park look weak at home, that it emboldened his enemies. And just 4 months later, Park was assassinated by his own intelligence chief, who might have thought the U.S. wouldn't mind. A broken summit may have accidentally signed his death warrant. This deep-seated fear of being abandoned, this powerful mistrust, it leads us directly to our third, and honestly, most chilling secret. The hidden nuclear ambitions that have been haunting the peninsula for half a century. So let me ask you a question. Which Korea do you think started the nuclear arms race? I mean, the immediate answer is North Korea, right? Of course it is. But that answer is wrong. The shocking truth is that South Korea had its own secret and very real nuclear weapons program all the way back in the 1970s. That's 2 full decades before North Korea's program became a global crisis. And the reason? The same one we keep coming back to: fear. After watching the U.S. pull out of South Vietnam, President Park was convinced he needed the ultimate insurance policy. The program only stopped because the U.S. found out and put immense pressure on him to shut it all down. So just how close did they get? Well, according to President Park's own words to an aide back in 1978, the weapon was 95% complete. His plan was to unveil it to the world and then step down from power. 95%. Just stop and imagine for a second how different history could have been. But what about North Korea's bomb? They started later, but as we all know, they succeeded. And one of the wildest secrets is where a ton of their funding came from. You might think China or Russia, but nope. A huge chunk of it came from the massive cash flow of Japan's pachinko industry. You know those pinball arcades? That industry was heavily controlled by pro-Pyongyang groups who funneled hundreds of millions of dollars back home to the regime. So after hearing about all this secret history, this deception, this fear, these near catastrophes, what's the big takeaway? Well, it seems to point to one single, unavoidable conclusion. The former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, looking back on all the horrors of the Vietnam War, said he learned 2 key lessons. First, you have to try to understand your enemy. And second, no matter how bad things get, leaders have to keep talking. These secret stories we've just gone through, they show us exactly what happens when that dialogue breaks down and when fear and mistrust take over. And that leaves us with one final, kind of unsettling thought. All these secrets we talked about, from Operation Smile to the 95% complete bomb, they all eventually came out. But it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What high-stakes games, what hidden ambitions, and what secret histories are being written on the Korean Peninsula right now as we speak?